and gentlemen, I'm Belinda Steyer, Vice President of Community Outreach for San Francisco Opera Guild. This evening's Insight panel discussion will be on Mark Adamo's The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Our Insight panel discussions are an opportunity to learn firsthand from the artists and the key members of the production team what goes on behind the scenes to bring this production to the main stage. Our moderator for this evening is Cranna, Director of Music Administration for the San Francisco Opera. I hope you will join us at our Insight panel series in the fall. And now, please join me in welcoming Cranna, who will introduce our panel. Thank you.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? I'm told we don't have to lean into these mics, which is a great thing for those of us with bad backs. So, welcome to the Conservatory. Thanks for finding your way over here. I know it's a little different from Herbst Theater, but San Francisco Opera audiences are resourceful, and you made it here. Great to have you, and it's my great pleasure to be with this bunch of creators of the opera, The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And I'm just going to very briefly introduce them so we can get right into all the many things we have to talk about. And let me start out by introducing the composer, who's in the middle there, and is on his third commission now from our general director, David Gockley. Two of them David commissioned in Houston, the phenomenally successful Little Women, which was performed on this stage just about a month ago here. You just missed it, I think. And then Lysistrata, also, or Lysistrata, I think it's better pronounced, and now The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. It's so great to have him here. He's been so generous with his time talking with audiences, and this is yet another occasion for that. Mark Adamo. On his left is the conductor of this opera, who's had a great deal to do in shaping it and getting it ready for a world premiere. He is the music director of the Colorado Music Festival and the Minnesota Opera, Michael Christie. Hello. Down on the end there, and we purposely placed him there because he has to dash off a little early for another event at the opera, an educational event at 7, is the director of this opera, who is specialized in a wide range of repertoire, but including a lot of modern pieces, including Doubt at Minnesota Opera, and upcoming engagements, which include the world premiere of Oscar, about Oscar Wilde, at Santa Fe this summer, and I guess later in Philadelphia, right? And also Manchurian Candidate in Minnesota Opera. Kevin Newbury. Next to Kevin is the creator of the title role in this opera, who is making her debut here, and we're so glad to have her, finally. I heard her just recently in a very different piece, singing the role of Magnolia in Showboat in Houston, a production that's going to be coming here, as you know, a year from now. She can be heard as Kitty Oppenheimer on the Metz recording, unfortunately not ours, of Dr. Atomic, and it's great to have her creating this role, and we're going to hear her talk about that. Sasha Cooke. Next to me, I'm so pleased to welcome a singer who made her debut last year at this time in Nixon in China. Was it a whole year ago? It seems like it. Only the other day, as Pat Nixon, was so spectacular in that role. And we were chatting backstage about another new work that she has performed recently, the role of Marie Antoinette in John Corigliano's The Ghost of Versailles, which she did both in St. Louis and at Wexford, conducted, I think, by our maestro here. This is Maria Kanyova. I forgot to mention that Maria is actually singing the role of Maria, or the Virgin Mary, I guess we would say in our old-fashioned parlance. She's called Miriam in this opera to distinguish her from the other Mary that is in the title role. Let's get started I'd like to have each of you tell us a little bit about how you got into this project and what your reactions were, your thoughts about being involved. Obviously, we should start with you, Mark. How did this idea come about, and what was David Gockley's reaction when you posed it to him?
Well, he was game, albeit wary, understandably. It began really in context of a conversation we've been having for a number of years. We worked together very beautifully on those first two pieces that you mentioned very kindly, and we were thinking of a piece for the large theater, of which the War Memorial Opera House obviously partakes, and large not only in scale, or rather large not only in practical scale, but in intellectual scale. That is to say, that a story that would not be a small story writ large, but an idea or a narrative that would really thrive rather than merely withstand the richness of a large chorus or an orchestra of 60 or so. And then I had come across an article I was on vacation in the Amazon in the Galapagos, and I'd taken an article by Joan Acacella called The Saintly Sinner, which had bounced off about 50 years of Magdalene scholarship, including but not limited to the non-canonical Gospels discovered in 1945, to give a very different and movingly human version of the story of Jesus and his followers, which was extremely different from the one that I had inherited, raised in Roman Catholicism. And so it occurred to me that if you could reconstruct from these data a credibly human original version of the story that we only know through its second or third hand and often miraculous elaborations, and if in that version the women could speak as eloquently as the men did, and in which all four of these characters would gain breadth or gain if you will, an exemplary nature by being closer to us. That is to say that they live in the same body that we live in, and they're making momentous decisions by the light that we have to see by and moral intuition and no more. And so when I wrote to David, I said, listen, all I really need to know at this point is which folder this goes into, under maybe or hell snowball in, because I don't know if it's possible yet either. You know, I really had not done the reading. I feel like I give a pretty good impression of a biblical scholar, but I promise you I did not know any of this material before 5 years ago. David said, I think there was a G involved, but said, sure, why don't you proceed and see what you come up with, and here we are.
So did he give you any givens or any no way sort of stipulations about this?
Not then. We had a lot of conversations that began with, are we really doing this? And I very often say, well, yeah, and here's why. But understandably, I mean, listen, and David is, as I don't need to tell anybody here, one of the most enterprising and one of the boldest entrepreneurs, not only in this city, but in this form on this continent ever. I mean, that career is one for the history books. I think that's as empirically verifiable as anything in our art form. So it was not a question of nervousness on his part, but I think we were both aware very early on that this story is not simply a beloved 19th century novel that's been filmed 5 times. I mean, this is a myth in the Greek sense of that term, not meaning lie, but one of those imaginative narratives by which you organize your moral imagination. I know that the story of Jesus as it was mediated in my life gave all of us in our family notions of identity and of community and of morality and how one deals with the big questions of life. So if I was going to say, look, I see another version of this that might hold up a mirror and maybe correct or complete certain ways of looking at this or certain ways of interpreting this story, neither of us, if either of us felt like doing that lightly would not be worth doing, do you know? So that was really, it was not, because it is, at this point, it all seems so emotionally logical that I feel like, well, God, how can it not go this way? And every now and then people remind me that, it's actually rather different from the way it's usually mediated. But, at this point, it just feels like, well, of course that's this way. But that was really the tenor of the conversation. Mm-hmm. If we're doing this, why are we doing this, and is it worth doing, and why?
Sasha, I'm curious, who did the call come from, and what was your reaction when you got it about being involved in this?
I think it was directly from Mark. Yeah. And my husband, who's here, and I went over to their house to have dinner with John and Mark, and now we're friends and have had lots of fun double dates together.
Yes. John Corigliano.
John Corigliano, and we sat down and you said, well, I'd like to offer you the role of Mary Magdalene. And my face sort of went white, like, what? Oh my gosh. And immediately, I was overwhelmed with happiness. And then the second thought was, oh wow, Mark, are you ready for this? This is going to be a roller coaster of fabulous, exciting, various responses from people. And so that was the beginning of our relationship as friends, and then throughout the last year, Mark and I have corresponded a lot about the role, and it's nice to be in a conservatory setting, actually, because it occurred to me today that it was at the conservatory level that I really came to know new music and started that love. And
Where was that?
at Juilliard. And I think even at Rice University, where I did my first degree, composers contacted me, and I did a couple premieres even then. And I had no idea that it would lead to something like this. So
Did you have sort of a preconception of the character of Mary Magdalene? What were your thoughts about her
super
before
limited.
this?
Well, probably what the typical layman would know about her, which is very little, but I find that so fabulous because there's a lot to dive into, but most of us aren't aware of it. So I knew that gave me, in a way, more freedom than, say, Nathan Gunn playing Jesus, where people do come in with a preconceived notion. For others, it's typically the saintly sinner, as Joan saw it. So, and I've told Mark, I really dove into the artwork at first because it was so fascinating to me that it was really that. She was either a way to show the female body, to show naked flesh in art, or she was the penitent sinner looking up to God, asking for forgiveness, holding the skull. And I thought, why was she there at the resurrection and the crucifixion? Why was she so close to the Virgin Mary? I mean, that seems like a huge query. I've been totally honored to go on this voyage with this team, and it's still continuing. It's just started.
Maria, it's one thing to play a character like Mary Magdalene, about whom we don't have too many prefixed notions, but everybody has some idea about the Beata Maria Vergine. What were your thoughts about stepping into this character?
Yes, we know not very much.
Well, I will just say that I was doing The Ghost of Versailles when Mark asked me to have coffee with him and discuss this potential new role in this new work. And he sat down and he had like some kind of trepidation about him, and I wasn't really sure what it was about. And he said, well, this is what the story's about. And if you want to do this part, you'll be portraying the Virgin Mary. And as he went on, I thought, I really was, beginning to worry about it. But as we talked about it more, and I have always had my own questions. I think we all sometimes look at what we believe, and we're not always sure, if that's really what we believe. And I have had many questions in my life over my religious experiences, and we talked for a long time about this, and I was very open to the idea of portraying this woman that we only know of without anything being written about her. She never said anything. There's nothing in the Bible of direct quotes of her. It's just
There's
who
the
she.
Magnificat, of course.
Yes,
Right.
but we just know her as the Virgin Mary, and really, how did all of that happen? So, I thought it was an amazingly interesting role to to introduce to everybody in this way. So.
What's been your biggest surprise so far in terms of how it's all developed?
Well, I think for me, I have an inner dialogue about what I think is going on in the opera, and I think it creates a lot of duality. It may not be what everybody is interpreting as they hear the role or read the surtitles, but I believe it. I believe it, and I think it makes this character very rich from the beginning to the end, so and believable.
Michael, tell us about your introduction into this. Had you worked with Mark before?
Mark and I have crossed paths in many, many different ways, all about opera, which is great. And it's very interesting. hearing my colleagues in this forum and others as well, Mark has been just the ultimate shepherd, no pun intended, in this whole experience. And I think he has been very delicate with us and very, very forthright about what it is that he put into the piece, what he has hoped that we would bring. We had a wonderful lunch in New York City to discuss this, and it was probably a shorter lunch than Mark thought, because in my mind, I just saw this as a terrific Verismo opera. I did not, none of the religious baggage interested me at all. Actually, I really, because I was raised Roman Catholic, but as soon as the idea came of representing the characters and representing them as human beings, my mind instantly went to the idea of, well, it certainly isn't that for 30 years in human life, everybody forgot how to fall in love, how to be disappointed, how to have dreams, how to die. I mean, that's just not possible. So of course, that if we're going to represent people at any point in the human spectrum, it's going to all be tangible human emotions. And so for me, I have to say, I just dove into it with a very strong expectation that we would bring to all those characters, regardless of what they did become in our own lives as humans through the generation, and just say, hey, Jesus didn't know he was Jesus at the time all of this stuff was happening, right? None of them knew any of the stuff none of them knew what they were going to become, just like none of us know what we're going to become. So I just thought, great, if they're in love, man, we're going to give it to them in love.
You mentioned the idea of Verismo. To me, in my mind, that conjures up really big, larger-than-life characters sort of in great conflict with one another and sort of big emotions. Is that
well,
kind
but
of
just
what you
think
had in
about the heroines in Puccini. I mean, Puccini gave us all but Turandot were very intimate views of all the characters, all the women that are portrayed in the Puccini operas. We have almost a magnifying glass, a spotlight shown on them quite specifically, and there are things that happen around them. I think this is exactly like that, except there are 4 spotlights that are going on. But for me, that whole tradition, that 19th century tradition, starting with Verdi and carrying on, is just so clear here, because we are blatantly trying not to have flowers dropping from the ceiling throughout all the telling of the story. There's dirt under the fingernails. The sandals might not fit perfectly. I mean, there's all that stuff that has to happen for this to be portrayed well, or frankly, we should just be doing it in a church. So that's my view.
Right. Kevin, what was your reaction when you got involved in this? Again, had you worked with Mark before?
I knew Mark socially, but we hadn't worked together, and
You saw the libretto, I take it.
I did,
Mark wrote
yes.
the libretto for this. I don't know if we mentioned
I mean,
that.
I'm most interested in doing work that will really challenge me and keep me up at night, and I found that with this piece, which is great. And honestly, I was having dinner with a mutual friend of ours, and he mentioned that Mark was looking for a director for this piece, and I thought, it has to be me. I'm going to do whatever it takes to fight for this piece and make it happen. I've always been drawn to comparative religious studies and all religions, and I look at a pivotal moment that got me into show business. It may sound funny, but in 1989, I remember seeing, as a teenager, the Madonna video for Like a Prayer, and thinking, religious and sexual ecstasy have a lot in common. And now I'm getting paid to tell those stories as an adult, and I always thank my parents for letting me watch MTV, and it sounds silly, but really those things actually interested me as a teenager. What are these stories? What is the place of sex in a spiritual tradition? How do we reconcile these characters that we know so much about? That we know they were real people, regardless of your religious background. They were real people, and a story like this that looks at them as real human beings, as Michael said, that experience loss and love and death. I was instantly drawn to the libretto. I loved Mark's music for years, so it was we had dinner and we shared some ideas, and I flew here to meet with David. I thought it was an interview, but I walked in and David said, "So what are you going to do with this? Good luck. Welcome aboard." And here we are.
So what has been your biggest challenge, would you say, in bringing it to life on the stage?
I think the biggest challenge was to strip away the iconography, and that we all come in with, my dad's a recovering Catholic. My mother's father was a Protestant minister, so I grew up with religion in the family in some ways, and I think everybody brings a certain amount of preconceived notions about these characters. Even if you don't have religious belief or subscribe to it, we have these images, as Sasha said, of what these characters looked like and how they behaved, even what colors they wore. And I think fighting through that to get to the emotional heart of these characters, it's funny, Maria and Sasha are sitting here, and I think what really unlocked your scene together that you'll all see when you come see the show was looking at a future mother-in-law and daughter-in-law the night before a wedding. And what is it that you are facing together as you start a life together, and if your son has a secret, you might want to know that, or if your future husband has a secret, you might want to know that from his mother the night before you get married. So looking at these characters, as I said, as real human beings was a challenge, but I think we really did that. We soldiered through it, and I think you're going to experience a real potent human relationships on stage. And as Mark has said, they could be called anybody. It could be about Tom and Sally, but it happens to be about Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Mark Kevin touched on this very important scene between Mary and Miriam, where secrets are revealed. And to me, that is, in a way, one of the most surprising elements of the opera, maybe even more so than the relationship of Mary Magdalene and Yeshua, as he's called in the opera of Jesus. Can you talk a little bit about where this idea came from, about the sort of conflict between Mary and his mother, and her, between Jesus and his mother,
Yes.
that is to say, and how that relates to her relationship with Mary Magdalene?
Sure. One thing, when one dives into, this world of biblical scholarship, you find things that people who are familiar with this literature agree were probably true, that somehow do not get out into the wider population. For example, Jane Schauberg, who used to be the chair of the University of Detroit Mercy and was a former nun, wrote a book in 1985 called The Illegitimacy of Jesus, a feminist theological inquiry into the infancy narratives, which I had not known at all. And it was a book that, this being 1985, simultaneously got her stripped of tenure and her car bombed, and was immediately put onto the reading list of the Harvard Divinity School as a masterpiece of biblical exegesis. Such is the world in which we live. But the thing that was really fascinating about it was that she was looking not even so much at the non-canonical Gospels, but at the New Testament, and saw everywhere evidence of, as she called it, an illegitimacy tradition, or more accurately, a broad and deep set of references that point to the perception of Jesus as an illegitimate child. So, for example, probably the most startling scene in the first act is the one that I drew from no source more outre than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is a scene in which Jesus is preaching on the steps of a synagogue in Capernaum, and says, essentially, if you were the people whom you say you are, you would know I were speaking the truth. And the elders say, yes, but we were not born of fornication. And in the Coptic equivalent of italic font, the we is stressed. So the implication is, unlike some of us on this stage. And then Mary and
Not
Mother...
this stage, but...
Right. Then Mother Mary and his half-brothers, James and Joseph, come on stage, and the elders say, isn't this Jesus Mary's son? Aren't James and Joseph his brothers? Which seems completely innocuous to us, speaking 21st century English. But if you are identified as the son of your mother, Mary's son, it is a very clear signal to those people who have the sort of dog whistling ears to hear it, that you are seen as having no legitimate father. And his mother and brothers say, Rabbi, forgive him, he's deranged, quote unquote. Other people in the crowd say, your mother and brothers are here. And Jesus says, your mother and fathers, my mother, my brothers, who are they? He who does not hate his family cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, and then flees. Now, that's not very useful homiletically, but as psychology, as the clues to a story, you think, where does that lead? And to bounce off of your question, all of the scholars that I have read have discussed, kind of wince to admit that you cannot find any language between Jesus and his mother in the canonical Gospels that is not marked by a pretty strong undertone of hostility. He is constantly calling her woman, which is really, it is not an honorific in context. And as Maria has noted, there's very little other dialogue. As an adult, there is that gorgeous hymn, the Magnificat, although even that has clues, because the sentence that is generally translated as the Lord has looked on his handmaiden in her lowliness is actually, the handmaid term is a very specific term that essentially means house concubine, and lowliness is better translated as humiliation. And so what we're looking at in the canonical Gospels, in Matthew's genealogy, X begat Y begat Z begat A, there are only 5 women in the story of Jesus' parentage. All of them have one thing and one thing only in common, which is a sexual scandal during their lifetimes that was redeemed by history. So in Maria's opening scene in that synagogue, and then later in 1:5, Mary Magdalene has been witness to both that first scene, in which the shadow of bastardy, if you will, is hanging over Yeshua.
What a vehement family that's
Yes, exactly. Well, my monologue for Miriam is invented, but it's asking a question that is right there in the text. What did she think after he said, "My mother, my brothers, who are they?" and fled to the stage after she came to rescue him? So that thread begins in that particular scene, and then it comes to a head in the wedding scene, in which Mary Magdalene overhears Yeshua saying something very strange to his principal disciple, but it is somewhat linked to a kind of charged feeling about women and sexuality, the narrative of which has begun in that scene. And so finally Mary Magdalene says, "Enough already. Why is it that when your son does something cruel, you take responsibility for it?" And so I've invented the scene in which Miriam unpacks that narrative, that it was not a miraculous birth, but that it was a birth that led to his being perceived as an illegitimate child. And then that puts a lot of Jesus' theological innovations, the principal among which is the presentation of God as the Father to all, regardless of race or sex or creed or whatnot. I happen to think that placing that as kind of the pearl of insight that he developed from a psychologically credible dilemma makes the story both more beautiful and more credible if it came from him having to deal with a pervasive sense of not being accepted by his society. And maybe he said, maybe it's not me, maybe it's society's licensing of only certain relationships or only certain classes of people. Maybe God loves all of us regardless of it. But that was the key. The key. Part of the struggle of this, and as Michael has put this, in a way, when I was sketching this out, and as both Sasha and Kevin said, at one point, I needed to get all the Jesus stuff out of my head, and I did a big search and replace. And for a while, this took place in a Brooklyn apartment, so that I could get into the human relationships without having all that iconography over on my back. But at one point I thought, it's really La Boheme if we took Rodolfo's play seriously. Because, Peter and Mary are saying, here's how the script should go. No, here's how the script should go. But that particular scene is signal in the method of the opera, because I thought you have to embed the ideas in relationships. Otherwise, it becomes, propaganda. It becomes, intellectual wish fulfillment cascading from a great height.
Kevin, tell us a little bit what to expect in terms of what we're going to see. How did you decide to convey this?
For me, the strength of the piece is it really does combine grand opera with the simple parable, passion play quality of the story. But of course, you can't really do something like this at San Francisco Opera with chairs and street clothes. It doesn't work as a parable on that level. You need to have an overall visual metaphor or an envelope in which to set the story. So very early on, our design team and I, and Mark, who was very involved in the process as well, we hit upon the idea of setting the piece literally in an archaeological dig in the Holy Land. So that, for me, the piece is really about searching and seeking for answers, both in your own lives as characters and through the eyes of the contemporary seekers that, as Mark writes, love this story and don't want to lose it. It's not about people that are pushing the story away and rejecting it. It's about people that want to love this tradition and make sense of it. And it seemed to me that this literal visual metaphor of digging into human history, looking at various strata of human history, was a good way into the story. So the whole piece takes place essentially on a unit set that looks like it could have been used in Indiana Jones. I mean, it's an archaeological dig. It's very naturalistic. The clothes are very naturalistic and very, pulled from different research of what clothing might have looked like in the turn of that's big century, of course. And there are moments of magic realism and stylization within it, but it feels like the whole story takes place in this one world of the archaeological dig.
And you've got these characters called Seekers. Maybe we should talk a little bit about them and what
Well, that's Mark's invention. The Seekers are the 10 characters that are essentially an extension of the chorus, wearing modern clothes, trying to make sense of this story. That was one of the initial challenges of the piece, is how do we use these Seekers to tell the story? They could just stand up there and watch the whole thing like a Greek chorus, but that's not very interesting. And we really developed a vocabulary that, truthfully, we really made sense of as late as last week, how it really does function in the storytelling, of how these 5 characters that are pulled out of the 10 are involved in observing and listening to the story. The ancient characters don't see them. But to give you one example that I think works quite well, that during the scene that Mark was just talking about, looking at one particular part of the opera, Sasha is listening to Maria's big revelation about Yeshua's birth and her connection to it. And then these 2 female seekers are in the room with them, listening to the story and taking it in very simply. We have wonderful actors that are doing it. And at the end, there's a real payoff that I won't give away when these seekers actually take this story, Mary Magdalene's story, that none of us got to hear. This story was kept from us, of course. And when we see the story through the lens of these modern seekers, I think it becomes all of you. It's everybody in the audience watching this story, as though we were allowed to go back in time and sit in the room with the 2 Marys and hear their story. So for me, it was revelatory and a big linchpin for unlocking how we were going to approach the whole storytelling.
Michael, can you talk a little bit about the soundscape in terms of the storytelling?
And on that note, I'm going to sneak off and go to this next event, but thank you all very much. It's nice.
Well, you're in for a wonderful oral treat. It is a grand opera both on the stage and in the pit, as well as chorally as well. The orchestra is a full symphony orchestra. There are full wind, full brass, a beautiful array of percussion. I think that's the use of piano, harp, and then bowed percussion instruments, so using a string player's bow on the bars of a glockenspiel or something like that to create this shimmering kind of awe effect. And then there are other times when the percussionists get to really almost have a very short concerto at times, which is quite magical, because we really get to play with a lot of colors to help transition scenes, as one might expect. But you'll really hear a lot of color coming from the pit. The chorus, as Kevin alluded to, is a Greek chorus. They are dressed in modern clothing, and they are set at the top of the archaeological dig, looking in, or in some cases, kind of speaking over what's happening, as if they're not seeing it, but reflecting on their own view of the story, and it just kind of they seem to be happening in parallel, I think. So, but it's a full chorus. I think it's 48 members, and so it's a big sound. But at the same time, what's very special is that for most of the opera, we really do focus on either pairings of the 4 principals or single voices with the orchestra sounding in these beautiful ways. I think what's kind of hearkening back to what I said about Verismo and a little bit of this connection to the 19th century is that the structure of this opera is going to feel very familiar. The way that Mark has constructed the sequence of arias, ensembles, the inclusion of the chorus to hold the scenes together and act as transition is a very familiar feeling that you would get with all of the great, especially middle to late 19th century opera composers. And so I think while our ears, of course, especially in the first time listening, will just be adapting to Mark's musical language, which is very beautiful, very melodic, I take a great deal of pleasure knowing that as we approach the climax of a scene, in comes the chorus and leads us very nicely into the next moment where suddenly Mary Magdalene is introduced and an aria introduces us to a character. So it's on one hand it's a very personal musical voice, right? And that is informed, that is making use of the greatest part of the grand opera tradition. And I feel like in so many ways, from the moment we start, you're in very, very familiar and very sensitive hands.
Mark, did you have any particular soundscape in mind for individual characters? Were you trying to associate sounds with ideas there?
Well, there's a pretty elaborate motivic plot, because once you make the decision that you are going to not embrace the miraculous, the question is, what do you substitute that with? And so we're
not changing water into wine.
Well, no, and I was kind of stout about that up front because I thought if number one, there was pretty strong evidence that was appended later. Certainly that's the case in the virgin birth narratives. But I also feel, even as some of the most glorious poetry on earth is in the Gospel of John, when you have the Jesus characters speaking in those deathless metaphors, I am the vine and you are the branches and all of that, there is a sense of a character being recollected in tranquility. I mean, the Jesus of John knows the end of the story from the beginning. I have no way of knowing metaphysically how much or little true that is, but it occurred to me that dramatically, it seemed to be much more important to have, again, human beings not knowing what the consequences of their decisions were. I mean, actually, Maria might be interested to know there was a beautiful aria that I had sketched out for her at the end of the second act, which I ultimately could not write, because I think I told Sasha this story, which is this moment where Mary Magdalene says, "What will you do now?" And this has been inspired by visiting the Mount of Olives, where legend has it, Mother Mary spent her last days preaching. And I loved the imagery, and every time I tried to write it, nothing happened. And I thought, because it's not true. She doesn't know that already. It completely breaks the rule of the show if she knows that she will be redeemed by history and is gazing off into the middle distance. So, I mean, what substituted for that was a sense of intuition, and that led into the motivic plot of the show. So that there are themes that migrate from character to character. Sometimes it is assumed that one character has very specifically overheard another, as the policeman when they quote a motive of Mary Magdalene's. Sometimes when Mother Mary and Yeshua both have the sense of being part of a design, you get the sense that had they known that they both had that feeling, probably the relationship would have been a little less fraught, So, but in terms of the actual harmonic language, it is more tonal than not. I mean, I think every composer has to say, what does the music sound like when it's really simple, and what does it sound like when it's really dense? And in this case, the simple music, sometimes you'll have a melodic paragraph over nothing more than a pedal C for 2 pages, and the timbres will kind of glitter. So the C natural will go from strings to the bowed percussion or the winds, but ultimately you are just hovering in harmonic space. Or you'll have, to get something granitic, you'll have a scale, but as the scale will be sounded, all the notes of it will build up. So you'll get something clusterish, but it's not Viennese, it's not 12-tone, but because that just didn't, listen, I've done that. I mean, there's 12-tone Resident Little Women of all things, but it felt wrong here. I mean, every score you feel like you need to, you kind of need to listen to it before you write it down. I didn't know, when I was sketching it, I thought, it must iridesce. I thought, yeah, great. What does that mean? Was that actually going to show me in terms of how I treat my harmonic materials?
Well, I think I would also add that there's a great sense of the music being horizontal and moving forward, rather than some of the stereotypical some people would think of modern music where it's just very isolated. There's none of that. And so what's so wonderful is that as the music glides, I think is kind of the way I would put it. That there's great tension. It's not like it's lacking in depth, but as we go into all the characterizations and the development of their emotions, you never feel like You never feel like the music just ceases, and then suddenly you're just whacked with something different. You are transitioned into everything very poetically.
Something I've been curious to ask our singers about, and I've never had a chance really, is relates to the libretto. Mark's libretto is in rhymed verse most of the time, and I'm curious if you find that both learning it and performing it, is that a help or a hindrance, or does it make any difference? What's been your experience, Maria?
I don't think it's a hindrance at all. I think it's quite helpful, actually, and it helps the music kind of sing itself. And it's done so artfully and so well. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's out of place. It seems just like it should be, as it is rhymed.
How about you, Sasha?
I really forgot that it was rhymed. And I haven't thought about it since I read the libretto years ago. So
It just naturally flows out. Yeah?
it doesn't feel rhymed, if that makes sense, because the music is evolving. So maybe that doesn't make sense, but I'm not connecting it to the word that matches the sound. You know what I mean? It's the end of a sentence. It's the end of an idea. So it doesn't feel like couplets. It doesn't feel like we're Shakespeare. You know what I mean? So, and there's so much. I mean, if anything, for me, I'm more related to the melodic repetition or the leitmotif-esque elements of his writing. You know, that I have one aria that is very repetitive, but it feels as if it's a play. And I could think, oh, I'm singing a similar line over and over again, but I'm not. I'm thinking about the words, thinking about what I'm saying. So yes, if I looked at it, I'd say, oh, there is repetition, but I don't think about that in the moment. So similarly, there is rhyme, but I'm not thinking about that in the moment at all. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. It is very nice in a new opera, especially since so many composers through compose these days, and it is not often, having done a lot of world premieres, to come back emotionally to a moment and the music comes back with that emotion, and in different ways. So maybe the intensity changes, but it is nice to hear this bum bum bum, this kneel, follow me, kneel to her, you know, that motive. It's really, it feels, as we've gotten there, it feels great. You really know that all the characters are something significant really is changing right in that moment, and to know that that is the direction of what we should be doing musically and dramatically. I like to have those arrival moments, those repetitions. They're great signals for us as performers.
It's actually been very tricky for me in terms of memory, because some of us sing the same lines, but with different meaning, different text, different narrative, different. So if I'm tired, in a moment, and we're doing Act 2, I could be singing the same melody, but I'll think of the words from Act 1, and I forget where I am, because you really have to be living the piece from beginning to end to know where they're related. Do you know what I mean? So there's so much repetition that you all will feel it. You're like, oh, I love this line. But for the performer who links music with text so closely that they don't live without the other, but Mark has challenged that, as have other composers, by using different words with the same melody. So you have to know exactly where you are in the piece in that moment.
Right, in the character's journey.
Mm-hmm. We're going to open up for questions from the audience in just a moment, but before we do that, there's one person we haven't talked about in this cast that I'd like to get your thoughts on, Mark, and that's, of course, the role of Peter and his relationship both with Yeshua and with Mary Magdalene. There's kind of a dynamic triangle there.
Peter actually was the hardest character for me to crack as a playwright, because the traditional version of him wasn't really adequate for my purposes, and the non-canonical Gospels just make him into the villain of the piece to such an extent that you're just expecting mustaches to be twirled. Do you know?
Maybe one reason why they were suppressed, would you think?
Well, a lot of them were. Yes, actually, it could very well have been, because at that point you had the beginnings of an Orthodox church. But it's in the non-canonical Gospels that you have the Gospel of Philip, Peter saying, "Make Mary leave us, for females are not worthy of this life." That's the Gospel of Thomas, forgive me. And Jesus rather disturbingly agreeing and going on. And I remember first researching that and thinking, that's not very nice. I can't use that. What an unpleasant person. You know, but the thing that, you know, actually Stephen Schwartz had mentioned this. He said there is a kind of, you know, old theater know-how that you have to give your villain your best song, which is sort of shorthand for, unless you have your antagonist have one moment in which the audience sits back and says, maybe he has a point, then you might not have drama, you might simply have propaganda. And in looking at Peter actually sort of backward through the lens of Paul, whose writings are the oldest Christian writings that survive, even older than the Gospels, you have in Paul part of the resistance to sexuality in general, and women in particular, that you find in the Gnostic Peter. That's where you get, it is better to be celibate as I am, but if you cannot, better to marry than to burn, which actually kind of links those two characters across time. But you also get in Paul a thoroughgoing, very social mission of political transformation. Here is where you go and make disciples of all the nations, whereas the Jesus of Matthew says, do not go among the Gentiles, essentially stick with your own. And so I thought, since we have a long tradition, Francis Bacon, he who has wife and child has given hostages to fortune. There is a note to a question. I think that certainly everyone I've ever known has had this question, do I stay home with my children or do I take this job? Do I, like Sunday in the Park with George, do I take Dot to the Follies or do I finish the hat? And it occurred to me that in spiritual terms as opposed to aesthetic ones, if Peter could say, look, the problem is not that I am opposed to girls because, ick, but because the personal happiness that you are finding, that maybe he himself is denying himself, although he too longs for it. Maybe that's distracting him from a mission to serve his community, and is he placing his own personal satisfaction over work that only he can do? I totally made that up, okay? Guilty as charged, because otherwise we have the Gospel of Mary. Peter, you have a constant inclination to anger and you are always ready to give into it. That's what the Gnostics say. That's quoted. But I thought I have to round that out in a certain way, and Bill is doing brilliantly with it. Really, everybody, listen, you have one of the greatest companies of singing actors and one of the best creative teams, conductor and director. It has been a privilege to do this rehearsal process. So if you don't like the show, it's entirely my fault.
Well, it just occurs to me as you talk about it now that Peter really is the link between us and this opera, because you wonder, why don't we know this story? Mm-hmm. And when you come to the end of the piece, you will have that answer, and it pretty simply is Peter, in a way, because that's what she struggles with. That's the battle that goes on. Is, each of them has either shoulder of Yeshua. She's for the spiritual, he's for the political. Agenda and heart. And so at the very end of the piece, you do feel like you're behind Mary, and you think, well, what happened? Why don't I know her story? But you do know. Because the whole time you've seen her struggle and you've realized the battle that she's dealt with. Is that not true?
Yes.
Peter creates a great solution in that way. Because otherwise it could feel like an art piece. A total, just imaginative wandering of, well, I don't get this. But we understand very clearly why she's not embraced.
Yeah. We might mention, for those who aren't completely all read up on this, there's so much to read. The so-called Gnostic Gospels that we refer to are mainly this group that were found in 1948, but the Gospel of Mary Magdalene has been known much older. 1898 was when it was discovered. And if you want to do any homework at all, you might read that. It's online, and skip to the very last couple of pages, because it's only about
because the first 10 are heavy going. Trust you me.
It's short, but it's very Gnostic, and you'll have.
Joe Nakachella's wonderful line was, "At this point, the text breaks off. 6 pages are missing, and readers may not regret their loss."
Anyway, that. is the story that I think we're trying to tell here.
Well, and the opera does have a lot of information on the website, on the San Francisco Opera's website. I would really encourage you to take the time to read, see the video of Mark speaking about through the San Francisco classical voice. Some really interesting things, even beyond what's been discussed here. I think it's really important to come as armed with the story that Mark is trying to tell as possible, because there's a lot of information being conveyed during the opera. So I would heartily encourage you to avail yourself.
Absolutely. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left before we have to wrap it up. So I'm sure there are some questions for this panel out there. I will repeat the question just to be sure that everyone hears it. Who wants to go first? Come on, now's your chance. Tori, go ahead.
Would you be able to tell us a little bit about how it progressed from research to libretto to composition?
Great question about the progression of this opera from the beginning to the end. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the workshop process.
Sure. Well, I did it a little bit of the way I did my first two, with the exception of first doing the reading to see if there was, again, a credible human story that could be constructed from these fragments. As Rebecca Lyman, I believe she's a Bay Area biblical scholar, said that one learns very early on in undertaking this work that to become a biblical scholar is to make peace with working with 6 puzzle pieces out of 1,000. None of which fit together, all of which are blue. So you just have to look at that and love it, But so the first question was, well, if for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, you have that make Mary leave us, and you have the illegitimacy narrative, and you have this bit from Mark, and you look, for example, at do not go among the Gentiles, go among the Gentiles and everybody else. How do you, can you make those dots on a dramatic graph? So that was the first question, to see if it was possible, so that I was not just making things up out of whole cloth. Then I do what I generally do, which is a kind of what I call sort of a silent movie screenplay, which is if the opera were written, but I were deaf and there was no language, but I was simply describing what was happening as I was seeing it, what would those sentences be? And I sort of made this up at one point, that every action would have to be no more than the width of a sentence, because if it was longer than that, it was too complicated. And I would only use an active verb. And so in many ways, that kind of gave me the actions which became the musical motives. Because as Michael notes, a lot of these actions, or a lot of these musical motives, began as actors acting. So there is that look at me, follow me, kneel to her, was in the, because it kept recurring, those moments of essentially, that was the imperative motive. Before there was language, before there was music, there was the actor. It's another of those moments when someone's commanding someone to do something else. And I thought that may end up being both resonant dramatically and useful symphonically. And I sent that outline to every smart person who would take my calls, and that went through various drafts. And then by the time we got to the first draft of the libretto, because I'd already been thinking of this thing musically, I mean, there had been another draft of an outline which I don't send to many other composers because they don't work the way I work. But after that outline was put away, I said, okay, now I'm in the theater. Now I'm blind, and I am hearing voices, but I can't speak the language. Now, what is the score? What is the music telling me about this emotional journey that I know about? And so that's when you started to get this sense, okay, I know the back to life motive is going to be Mary Magdalene's entrance, and it is going to undulate, and it's going to feel like every moment is opening one beautiful vista after another. What is that going to translate into musically? And so I thought, well, if it is triadic, but you get the sense of constant modulation, never really landing, So it's all transition and very few moments of home key. And again, just sketching, not a pitch, nothing at the piano, just some sense of here's what this texture is going to be, as opposed to something more fiery and rhythmically severe, and the voice is like racing ahead of the orchestra as if like a horse going out of the gate, which was the first sketch of what became Yeshua's Fire aria. And so when that sketch, got refined, then we went to the first draft of the libretto, but that was kind of the first draft of the score, because now I'm doing actual language, but I have a sense of this kind of oceanic royal of Mary Magdalene's first aria. So some of the line lengths, the rhyme scheme, sometimes the rhymes can be quite brittle, sometimes they kind of loop in on each other and they chime in different places. Because in a certain way, rhyme is to language what articulation is to instrumental line. You know, if I hum a line to you that goes dia-da-dun-da-dun, or dia-da-dun-da-dun, that staccato eighth at the end is letting you know maybe the phrase ends there. That to me is what rhyme does. You know, it's a way of importing sound into the language to support audible phrase. And so then the libretto was submitted, and then that went through various drafts. And then we had a workshop here, December of 11, just with piano and without chorus. And at that point, and I hope that it would not need too much, but Nathan pointed out one very important dramatic beat that was missing based on the workshop, which is now his Act 2 sort of Gethsemane monologue. And we went from there. It's been refined all along this moment, but that's the basic shape.
Who else has a question? Yes, go ahead.
How did the name Yeshua come about? How did you choose that?
Why is he Yeshua instead of Jesus?
Well, part of it was my best. Yeshua and Miriam are the two kind of Hebrew/Aramaic original versions of those names, because I was trying to get in the nomenclature a sense that this was a story happening before there was anything like Christianity. You know, we don't know to this day whether Jesus was trying to actually form a new religion or merely reinvigorate his own tradition. You know, and because both Yeshua and Miriam kind of had that Hebraic ring, I could do that, but for the life of me, I could not find any credible, archaic, earlier version of Mary Magdalene or Peter. I mean, Peter is actually a masculinization of the word Petra, which is the female noun for rock, and I could call him Petrus, but then I thought, now it starts to get a little bit coy. You know, we're doing these people, but we're not really doing these people. So I thought that the Yeshua and Miriam kind of covered that without seeming like we were trying to avoid the issue.
Another one? Nobody else wants to leap in there? Yes, go ahead.
Sometimes composers or stage directors make changes after rehearsals.
Mm-hmm.
Did you make any changes, and if so, were any changes made after yesterday's dress rehearsal?
I was asking, were there changes made in rehearsal, including any after the dress rehearsal yesterday?
Well, if any were made after the dress rehearsal, it'll be a surprise to me. So show up on Wednesday and we'll see what happens. No, we've been doing stuff, you know, along the way. I mean, the lovely thing is that because, again, it's been such a great team all along, you know, Sasha and I have been in correspondence exactly about where this aria fits in her particular instrument, so that we both get the colors we want from it vocally. Nathan was good enough to indulge me in a 2-hour meeting really about one F sharp. You know, which happened to you, but I mean, had it had to been F natural, I would have had to reorchestrate because it was the open strings of the cello and God knows what. But I mean, but the lovely thing is, by the time we started here, it was pretty clean. But you know, you still never know. We've still been doing little osseas, or you know, can we take this up the octave or shorten this? Or the biggest, I think, cut actually. Right? Am I correct here? Was in the wedding scene, where there was one sort of moment where Yeshua and Mary Magdalene seemed to be reconciling prematurely this conflict that they were having. And I had, you know, kind of loved this motivic return, but it sort of put Mary Magdalene in between dramatic beats. Am I with you? Am I resisting you? What's happening? So finally we just cut her part of the duet, you know, and cut a little bit of that, and suddenly it's just a lot cleaner. Do you know, that moment of the storytelling is now, we tighten the lens that much.
Of course, we were just off stage talking about changing something. Right before walking on, the director was saying, so how do we make the bedroom scene just a little bit hotter? Okay, well, maybe we'll show some shoulder. And so we were talking about, and I think that's going to happen. And Michael has said, let's give each other thoughts until the last performance. So yes, there are changes, but they're good ones. You know, how did this feel on this night? Did you like the tempo here? Should we, you know, so that's all part of the process.
Yeah, and I think also it's great that people were able to see the dress rehearsal, but you have to remember that we spent, the process is that we spent about 4 weeks in a rehearsal space at the Davies Hall, and the cellar box space. And then during that time, costuming happens. We don't do the costumes until we're on stage, and so about 4 nights ago, we had a rehearsal with the costumes, the first time with the makeup, and then on Saturday night, we had no costumes, no makeup, no lighting. It was just all for the music and getting all that. And then yesterday, we had a live audience. For the first time, we were wondering, what will they laugh? Will they clap? How's it gonna work? And then everybody's dealing with any other changes that might have happened with their costumes, blocking. Sometimes this stuff's happening. And so I think, honestly, these couple of days in between that dress rehearsal and Wednesday are really quite fertile ground for us, not to make changes, but rather just to think, okay, now I know what the elements feel like, although maybe we've had them 2 or 3 times only. Now where does it go? I mean, even from that first orchestra rehearsal on Thursday with everybody till yesterday's dress rehearsal, we cut 8 minutes off of the first half, just by keeping the tempos going. And so already, just in those few days, we were already playing with some things, and I was asking people to do different things, and but nothing like dramatically just taking things out. So it's a very interesting process, but for people who saw it yesterday, it was definitely one of those tactile moments where it's like, oh, that's what that feels like. That's what it looks like when the lights are shining on us this way. And so now we just hope that as we all continue to find our place and our rhythm with it, that it goes from technique into breathing into more of a life, if that makes sense.
So where the evolution will continue in one way or another, maybe just in people's minds between now and Wednesday night. And I want to thank these people for their generous giving of time tonight. Is there one more question out there before we wrap it up? Go ahead.
Nathan Gunn always takes his shirt off if you consider that.
Question about whether Nathan will have his shirt off again?
Actually, because we are playing with so many traditions in this role, including that of the shirtless Nathan Gunn, we have decided to put them in a button down for the crucifixion.
You'll have to just come and check and make sure that. Thank you all for being here. See you at the opera.
All right.